Good morning, stroke warriors and families everywhere. I am pleased to have a very special guest with us today, Dr. James Hutson. Is that the right way to pronounce it with the T?
That is correct. I get Hudson a lot for the Hudson River, but that's right. It's a T.
Okay, all right. Thank you for being with us today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I hope we can share some information that will be of interest and use to those listening. So
I hope.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time. Let's get started a little bit about your background, your professional background.
Mhm.
What are you involved in?
Exactly. My professional background, actually, I was raised by an artist. And so for all of my schooling up until finishing my bachelor's degree, I was going to be an artist. I got a degree in oil painting and then decided instead I wanted to go on and I was fairly good at telling stories and framing things for individuals with complex concepts. So I went and I got a master's in art history to look at the sociocultural aspects of how various cultures represent, notions of, religion, hegemony, power structures, politics, gods, kings, etc. Then I went on to get a PhD in art history and archaeology as well at the University of Maryland. I taught in the DC area, a number of institutions there, American University, Towson University, obviously University of Maryland, for about 7 years. And then I came out here to St. Louis, where I was hired to start up the art history department in 2010. So at that time, it was non-existent. So after 6 years, I grew that, restructured it, had a healthy undergraduate population. Then I was put in charge of online and graduate programming. So that then led to a different career path where I needed to learn things such as business, accounting, management, things like that. So I got a degree in business and leadership, actually, a master's. And then I was put in charge in 2019 of virtual reality. And so I was told, see if we can integrate virtual reality as it was an up and coming thing at the time. Not many people outside of computer science labs were actually integrating it because it was too costly, it was expensive. You had tethered headsets, they had to run on computers with very expensive GPUs. And so it wasn't seen outside of that community. So I put forth or gathered the VR champions together, individuals that were interested in all fields and how that's going to be affecting or could provide a more immersive educational experience and what else that might benefit them. As well. So then I realized that most VR experiences are created via game engines. So I went back and got a master's in game design. So I forced myself to learn these physics engines. They're free. So Unity and Unreal Engine are the two most popular ones. Anyone can access them, but it is like taking a film crew that's all yours again, messing with physics, lighting, camera, rigging, right, and then going into coding as well. So you really have to force yourself to do it. You need something at stake. So I did that. I set up our XR and gaming lab. Then the pandemic hit, and so we really ramped up. How do we close the gap, right, between student-to-student interaction, student-instructor interaction? How do we give people the education that they need, showing them these real-world circumstances, whether it's going to be, viewing the Coliseum and or, working with paramedics in order to resuscitate someone from a car crash, etc. So very specialized kind of medical things we can talk about here. So set that up, and then we restructured again. And I was told in 2021 by my new dean, look at artificial intelligence. And so we did an institution-wide study, saw how AI was already being used. It was under the hood at the time. People didn't really know that they were using AI very often, and many people listening right now probably don't know the extent to which it's running in the background of almost everything they interact with on a daily basis. And that's how it was, right? It was kind of this invisible thing. But we have very concrete examples. How was it used in education? It was used to identify by eye tracking students that were having reading difficulty that maybe need to be diagnosed dyslexic and or need additional help. It's being used in sorry, AI, yeah. Then AI, of course, that's computer vision is being used obviously on our side through computer vision to track and analyze various different types of stylistic analyses. But there's it across the board, it was already being used in 2021. And then in 2022, obviously, ChatGPT launched in November, and we all went down to a long winter's nap. And a few of us got busy realizing the world had changed once we started playing with it. That being, so when we came back, everyone freaked out. States banned it. No one knew what to do. And still, we're looking at the ripple effects of what the black hole will be. But I realized then that this wasn't going away. And so I got a PhD in artificial intelligence as well. I have roughly about 10 books on the topic and over 100 articles, 5 chapters. So I can speak to the impact emergent technologies are having in various areas from education, healthcare, cultural heritage sector, etc. But for the purposes of this podcast, probably the area of our research that would be of most interest is going to be that of how do we use technology for social good? How do we use it to support us in our everyday lives, especially both psychologically, mentally, physically, right, in order to improve just the quality of living.
What experience, personal or professional, I guess, has shaped your approach to integrating technology into healthcare?
Mm-hmm. That actually started 5 years ago when our son was having difficulty in school. He was actually kicked out of one of his schools for behavioral problems, and we didn't understand. We took to counselor, psychologist after psychologist, and then he had an assessment in kindergarten, and it came back level 2 diagnosis of autism. And so that then triggered, obviously, the first thing they said was, well, you know, it's hereditary, right? And so luckily we got him an individualized educational plan. He's doing very well, but we had to then start researching what are the sensory processing conditions associated with it that would be leading to such types of reactions, right, in this way. So then concurrently, we find that my wife also, we were looking more into, okay, this is a neurological condition that he has. It's just a different way of processing the world. And we have to understand about the neuroscience, the neurobiology. So we have books on neuroarts and neuroaesthetics, for instance, if you want more information on the benefits there. But then my wife got a brain scan and we found out that she as well is neuroacquired. She apparently had an accident when she was a child and is missing a large part of her occipital lobe. And
Oh,
so
wow.
that's part of like processing. So she as well, much like a stroke is going to be neuroacquired, right? It's going to be a condition that's acquired given a particular incident and or occurrence during the part of your life, which changes how you process the world neurologically. And so that led us to really VR for good, that being the early and probably the most popular and most cited of my studies, interestingly enough, was the simplest. It was just we are framing the way in which we're using technology wrong. So this was it was about 5 years ago, right when he had his diagnosis. All of the technology that you see out there for individuals, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, right, various neurological conditions, PTSD, for instance. All of them are framed in such a way to fix you, to make you better, right, in this way. Whereas that's not how we should be looking at it. We should be looking at it from the sense of how can we use technology to change our environment, thus, of course, removing the difficulties to begin with, right? And so once again, we can control much more of our sensory input now than we ever could, right? And that's just progressing rapidly. We can talk about again VR. We can talk about smartphones. Smartphones and smart glasses. as well as the various ear pod technology for hearing loss, etc. But that really kind of set the stage for where we went from there. Is not to use technology to make people like everyone else, quote unquote normative, normal, as far as abilities, as far as how you process information, as far as how you interact with the world, but instead, how can we use technology to level the playing field and allow individuals to access the world on their terms that works for them, right? Because we're in a post-pandemic world. We don't have to go into the office. We don't have to stand by the water cooler and chit chat. A lot of the things that we're doing are completely outmoded and outdated because technology allows us a greater range in which to exchange information with one another. But that's the personal. And I think if you look at anyone that's going to be in neurodiversity, or I do not like the term, but it's still what publishers use, disability studies. That's an outdated term as well. But everyone who's really passionate about it usually has someone, if not themselves, close to them that motivates them in order to make it personal, to try to use what they know and what they're doing to benefit society at large. But there's always something that's closer to home driving them.
Well, I'm curious that when you do a first time, I guess, assessment or analysis of a new patient, do you do some kind of brain pathways analysis first and then program? Do you detail a program that helps them and their health recovery?
Well, I'm not a physician, so what
Right.
I've worked on things like that
Okay.
in the sense that I can speak to some of the projects that we have done. So, for instance, we partner with over 100 international researchers, and there's a very tight knit, very passionate community, certainly around autism, but around neurodiversity, neurological conditions in general. And so, one of the largest labs we work with is actually the University of Laval in Quebec. In Canada. And so they have a large lab associated with using technology to support those with various neurological conditions. So one of them, closer to what you were asking, is associated with two prototypes that we developed, one built upon the other. The first one was, how do we use virtual reality to prepare those that have been diagnosed with autism level 3 to enter the workforce? Because we find that most of those with neurological conditions want to work. As you were noting yourself, earlier on, you went back to work, et cetera. They want to, right? But they're not given the support in order to make that possible in many ways, either psychological, environmental, or physical, right, in this way. So as part of that, though, there was a diagnostic eye tracking associated with it to ensure. But the same type of system was reused for studies on aging in home, right? Whereby Canada has the same problem as the United States has, in that culturally, we would, if we were in Eastern cultures, you would be living in extended family groups. And so as you aged, you would then have your children or children's children to support you. But in a Western civilization, we kind of have it set up to where that's not as accepted because of this notion of autonomy. And so, and people want to stay in their home. They want to be autonomous, right, throughout their lives. And so we looked at an Internet of Things type study of how can we do that, right? Because as of course, where housing is located in suburbs, et cetera, is usually away from things that are needed, such as grocery, food, essentials, staples, et cetera. So we have pharmacists, right, doctors, all of that. So we looked at ways in which to use the Internet of Things to kind of close that loop, right? Everything from reminding of medication to assisting in, especially with dementia patients. That's another study we did on using AI and singing therapy to offset or alleviate the symptoms of dementia. Because, as you've probably seen, those that have the later stages of dementia lose memory of a lot of things, but what they will come come back to will be songs from formative years in their youth. So one example was a 103-year-old woman who was a ballerina dancer, and who was completely non-responsive, and the very famous case. And they played the song she was famous for dancing to in ballet, and she immediately started singing along and dancing. So that's some of the ways in which we've used it, but not so much. We're looking more now into the breakthroughs associated with diagnostic criteria. Now,
Right.
I think you were talking about, earlier on, for instance, how is AI changing healthcare in general? And so the diagnostic part of healthcare is probably one of the most important, because it then sets the precedent for what will a treatment regimen be, what will a recovery, the steps to be thereafter, what's the prognosis, etc. So that's usually a very important early point, and a misdiagnosis is, of course, going to usually be crippling in many ways. So, but AI has been in doctors' offices for 20 years now. So when you go into a standard doctor's visit, what you generally do is the nurse comes in, right, takes your blood pressure, takes your height and weight, looks at your BMI, looks at your oxygen level with a little thing on your finger, obviously. So gets base level, right, biometrics. All of that, of course, can now be gathered almost instantaneously with wearable smart devices, everything from smart watches to, again, devices that attach. So it monitors your A1C levels if you're diabetic, for instance. So the monitoring is there, and that's something that is here now. But what they're doing in doctors' offices is entering that information. The doctor comes in and just verifies, does the same thing again. Let me listen to your breathing. Let me listen to your heart rate, right, just to confirm what the nurse had. But then they put it into a program, right, that they have on their laptop, generally in front of them. You'll notice that stenographers went away. So when you're visiting the doctor now, you used to have someone typing everything out, right, for legal and regulatory purposes.
Right. Right.
They're gone, right? Because AI does that automatically now. So many stenographers and those that would translate or write captions for TV shows have been automated out. So that's automatic. So what's happening is it's listening to all that, it's transcribing it, and then you're plugging into this preset form, a template, right? This information, which says you're going to be a male, in my case, 45 years of age, Caucasian. Here's height and weight. Here's blood pressure. Do we have a history of, once again, high or low blood pressure, etc.? And then it spits out recommendations, right? So the doctor has already been using AI for recommended diagnoses, right, for 2 decades. So then they would say, okay, what type of medication might you recommend for high blood pressure? And so then then it'll give you, okay, we recommend these three. Okay, but we know this person's allergic to this and reacted negatively to this one with a dangerous drop in blood pressure. So we then recommend this other one. This is all being done automatically behind the scenes. And so we're just taking what has already been done and making it mobile. So so the notion that, and the most recent studies have demonstrated that your basic AI using computer vision, and even the four models of your large language models for natural language processing, are 17% more accurate than human doctors in diagnosing. Right. So a famous example of that is our president at our university. His father kept having arrhythmias and cardiac issues, and they went to specialist after specialist after specialist, and no one knew what it was. He sat down one day and put it into ChatGPT 4, and it actually correctly diagnosed, right, what he had, and they went and confirmed with a doctor. So the good thing here is everyone's going to have access to their own live, real-time access, just like with your glasses. We'll get to that here in a minute, but all glasses will be like these that have, again, a built-in computer, access to AI, and cameras. Right, whereby you'll say what your symptoms are, and you can ask, what should I be concerned? What should I do next? What are the next steps, etc. And it does this live, right? And it can also immediately, without you moving, if you need to, reach out, right? So with just a touch of the button, if you need to call someone, if it needs to contact anyone, etc. So these exist now, and then we can talk about what's coming this year with robotics.
That sounds incredible. What is there some kind of role that's there's an interdisciplinary collaboration with, or what's key partners in improving healthcare with what you do?
Yeah, well, I think everyone here, including you, knows the first answer to that is actually having the patient's best interest at heart. So that's number one. We saw the tragic, assassination recently of the head of a healthcare organization, and the reactions were not sympathetic, right? And there was a reason for that. Is that our healthcare system, not so much in Canada, it's very different. Everyone has access to the solutions that we're coming up with there. Um, uh,
Right.
is designed to maximize profits and to minimize costs by way of it. So even getting your insurance to sign off on like a CT scan that you might need could be denied. And of course, lawyers will tell you get the name of the person who denied it so you can go back and sue them later if once again it turned out that you needed that CT scan and you had a brain tumor, right? So step one is actually working with people that are not trying to maximize profit, but instead have a personal investment in the outcome and solution of what they're trying to do. Usually because they are thinking of a loved one, right, when they're doing it, right? So that being, how will this benefit my son, my wife, my father, my daughter, etc. So that's kind of step one. Everyone I know that I work with has a relative or a loved one, right, that they are directly referencing whenever they're working on this. So that's kind of step one. Step two is, of course, looking for different types of expertise. Right. So I don't have a biomechanical, bioengineering background or a neuroscience background. But I do have a multidisciplinary background that brings many more things together. So you want to have people, number one, that have the technical expertise. All right. So you bring in a programmer, you bring in someone, depending on what device you're making. If it's hardware, bring in your engineer, right? So or software engineer if it's software, right? So but those people are a means to an end, right? So they're just part of the team that usually gets a lot of credit, but what they're doing and how they're being directed are by the people that have something at stake, right? They got skin in the game. In that they understand the human-centered design aspect of what they're trying to do, and that's really the best process you can take and think in terms of identifying problem first design thinking. That being, and this is a great example. If we have lots of things that are very expensive that come along, as you know, we have exosuits, right? I was talking to a biomechanical engineer on Tuesday, and he specializes in very simple wearable appliances for those that are going through recovery and need a type of PT, right? Physical therapy, right? But so he's like, but who can afford a $10,000 exosuit, right? So it's awesome, it looks great, you can move around, right, and be the Terminator, but it's priced out of the range of most people, and insurance is not going to cover it. And so we really need to think about what is the actual problem we're trying to address. A famous example in design thinking is a group notes that the aged population in a community states that they want the ability to be more mobile, right, in order to see their families, right? So they go off, and this team famously comes up with various strategies to add mobility to individuals that have difficulty. Like my wife's grandmother sadly just passed; she had Parkinson's, for instance, and so it's really difficult to get around. So they came up with wonderful, engineering solutions. But then another team actually asked the people, that being, why do you want to be mobile? Why do you want to go see your families and your children? And it turned out they were lonely. right? And it's like, oh, okay, it's not a problem of mobility then, it's a problem of loneliness. So how do we bridge the gap and solve the real problem? And so they came up with a very inexpensive solution associated with, the same thing we do with like, telehealth, meetings and things like that. Very simple devices that allow them to always be in touch with their grandchildren, always have contact with people, and it solved the real problem. So that's kind of what we're seeing here is a lot of companies are driven by either profit or problem solving, right? So but usually when they're problem solving, and this is the problem with most AI engineers as well. And if you think of big tech, think of like Sam Altman and others who are announcing the arrival of artificial general intelligence in the next month, right? So they're generally focused on the problem of how to advance the model. How do I perfect my algorithm? How do I move this mathematical equation forward? And that's what we see. Like in Duke University, I work with a neuroscientist who also has a background in AI bioethics. And so that's what she keeps saying is, okay, who do you talk to have these conversations with about how AI is impacting society? He's like, well, I can't talk to people in my department because they just want to talk about the math behind it. That's all they're focused on. They're not seeing the social implications. So she has to go to another department. So that's why the important thing is you have to have a variety of perspectives and backgrounds so you don't get groupthink, right? When you have 10 AI researchers and mathematicians in a room, they're going to think like AI researchers and mathematicians, and that being the goal is to make AI better. No, the goal is to devise a tool and to use it as a tool to problem solve for a problem we actually have in the real world, right? So that's what we need to think about.
So that's, as I understand that, you need a team not only of the AI or the technology people, but you also need the professionals, the neurologists, the occupational therapists, the physical therapists to participate in that solution.
And what you mentioned right now is a great point because the occupational and physical therapists are usually left out. Like the people that are boots on the ground are usually the last people to be brought in, and it's usually just at the testing phase at the very end. That being, here we made this. We'll pay you to try it out and then give us the study results verifying that it works, right? So it's usually at the very end that they're brought in, but they need to be there in the beginning. So it's those that are actually seeing the problem firsthand really need to be in the room.
How do we promote that collaboration? I mean, does it come from the recovery of the patient? Does it come from AI to engineers getting more extroverted and asking for that kind of help? Does it, because I mean, that's the perception anyway. So how does that get built?
Yeah, so as far as, and sadly, most AI researchers look like me, right? So you find that it is difficult to find diversity and it is difficult to find women. And so that's one of the main reasons why AI got a bad rap in the early 2000s is you had a bunch of white guys that were looking at the world from their perspective. And so they did things like solutions for computer vision that didn't recognize, say, African American skin tone, right? So, or they didn't realize that it would be misogynistic because they were thinking of interacting with a man. So yes, step one is you need a greater variety of AI researchers, but that's not really important as much anymore. It takes less and less specialization. Anyone on this anyone on this podcast can go and make their own custom GPT, their own agent that does exactly what they want with no background, right? So I can give you the steps right now of clicking on a link and it says, what do you want this to do? I want it to give me advice on rehabilitation for those that recently suffered a stroke. I want you to use this information, upload a diagnostic manual or a rehabilitation manual. You're going to use this as a reference. And then when you don't know the answer, you're going to reach out to these databases of the most recent research. And then I want you to be friendly, affable, likable, and reassuring. I want you to come up with, a persona that is usually people find, and this is just an example, but studies have proven it, we're much more comfortable with letting a woman into our home than a man. And so you'll notice that Alexa, Siri, all of those are female voices. So you like a reassuring female voice, for instance, like Scarlett Johansson, which is what Sam Altman tried to get her to be the voice of OpenAI.
Right.
And she said no, so they just cloned her voice anyway.
Yeah.
So but you can do all that immediately. You don't need a background in coding. You don't need to know Python. You don't even need to know what a neural network is, right? So less and less do we need the AI specialists that are actually training the models, because you can all train your own models. Now the technology's out there. You can go on GitHub and get your own basic 3-level model that's trained on book 3 for free, right? The genie's not going back in the bottle. You can make your own and build up whatever you want it to do. The question then becomes, what do we want it to do? That's the real question, and that's actually the problem I'm discussing with our AI engineering research task force. Is all we're seeing now in studies. I review journals every day as a reviewer, right? Seeing the latest research, and all anyone wants to do is compare how good these tools are compared to their human counterparts. So one this morning was, how well can AI identify and categorize emotions in someone who's speaking versus a human counselor, right? And so that's a great example. But the point is, who cares? The point is that it's going to be better, right, than a human eventually. But once it can do that, what do you want it to do, right? So that being this is the question. We've already reached over PhD level sophistication. In case those listening weren't aware, but back in December 13th, OpenAI demonstrated their O3 model, which beat out the top 3 major tests that they give to see if something is at or above superhuman intelligence, and it beat all of them. So that's it's way too expensive. It takes $1,000 per query to run a question, so it's not practical, but it's already here. So we need to stop asking questions and get doctors' egos out of the way, because that's what it always is that no one can do what I do. I'm a doctor. I lord over life and death, right? I control, and I'm the one that decides, etc. When in fact doctors haven't been utilizing their education to make diagnoses themselves for decades, right? They've been leaning on these tools to assist, to augment them. So the question now becomes, let's assume that it can use these diagnostic criteria to find out things quicker, to identify treatment and or rehabilitation steps quicker and more efficiently. And then the next step is, let's bring it in the real world with hardware. Right. So once we have that, we already have the ability to get those steps, to outline step by step. Now give me a treatment regimen. Now give me what I should be doing each day to help exercise, right, a weak side of my body, or to help, once again, my verbal skills and bring back my verbal articulation. So it'll do all that. But now robots are entering it. You have wearables, which are widely available and cheap, right? So everyone's going to have wearables to monitor their health 24/7. And you can have it set up to automatically contact someone. But with that information, with that biometric data, right, you then can act on it in the real world. Shipping January 1st was over, I think, 100,000 humanoid robots, right, went out to households. $12,000 each. They're going to half in cost by next year, because people are going to want the latest model. So you can buy your used model for like $5,000. But everyone's going to have an in-home robot. So what does that mean? That means that whereas caretakers, and once again, that's this is both an emotional strain, a financial, a fiscal strain, right, and a professional strain. If, once again, you have, right, a father, a mother, a loved one that's had a stroke, and you need to be there, right, in order to assist with rehabilitation, medication, etc., it puts a great strain that we don't need to be doing, because now you're going to have something that trains on you as to what you want, how you talk, what you prefer, what your regimen is, what your daily routine is. Do you like listening to music at a certain time, or reading, or watching TV? That can handle the other stuff like taking out the trash, doing the laundry, folding the laundry, doing the dishes, putting away the dishes, cooking, right? So getting medication, right? Reminding and physically bringing medication, right? Helping with physical therapy, right? Instead of a human, they can assist with that. So all of that shipping now. Now, obviously, not everyone, and certainly Medicare and insurance is not going to cover $12,000 robots for us right now, but it's certainly much cheaper than a lot of. I mean, I have a smart bed, for instance, so a sleep number bed. I think that thing was nearly $10,000, right? So because it adjusts
Right.
automatically up and down, so it's basically a hospital bed. So if you think of the additional hardware and the expense and the cost of rehabilitation or aging in home, depending upon mobility, you're already spending money on various mobility apparatuses, beds. I know my grandfather had a very specific, expensive lazy boy that he had purchased that actually would rotate up and down, given the discomfort, right, of the spine. So those all add up. So I see this as really moving us into away from worrying as much about the physical aspects of it, and now we can think about the psychological and the mental aspects of rehabilitation.
When is it appropriate to transition from traditional therapies to more technology driven rehabilitation methods? Is there a starting point where you should start looking for clinical trials or accessible technology?
Now I'm not qualified to answer that one specifically, but I will say that framing it is we shouldn't differentiate between using technology 24/7 for anything that makes our lives better, especially that makes us more healthy and have a better quality of life. So, and with that, it doesn't have to be robotics. It doesn't have to be, exosuits or additional supports that are going to bolt on legs, anything like that. It can be just information, and everyone should be utilizing the free information that they have. So whether or not it's going to be on your smartphone, your desktop, or your glasses, pretty much everyone has a smartphone now. So even I was watching a documentary on the unhoused in LA, and even those that don't have permanent living conditions all have smartphones, right? Which so even the homeless don't have smartphones. So they have smartphones.
Right.
So everyone has the ability to download all of the apps, and they're all verbal now. They're all going to be voice activated, just like Siri, etc. And you can go through and ask anything at any time to it. So you can have a running chat. I would actually recommend training an agent, right? Everyone's talking about AI agents now. So you are my rehabilitation agent. This is your job. Here's how you're going to interact with me. Here's the information you're going to give me. And so anytime that you need to say, okay, I forgot what activities we were supposed to do today, in what number, in what how many, to what extent, are we raising heart rate, are we improving fine motor skills, are we looking at muscle development, etc. So and then it will always give you or walk you through, right, the steps, right, and or either motivate, tell you things, etc. And so from the standpoint of having the most sophisticated database known to man, with over 100 billion parameters, right, freely available, right? So use that now. As far as clinical trials, you can look at, if you want to try something different. Like a study just came out that said this type of intervention has a much better prognosis for like early recovery. You can feed it in and say, okay, you're going to follow this trial. You're going to follow the steps that they did. And it's usually not going to be something incredibly invasive, such as requiring injections or some type of surgery, etc. It's usually going to be frequency, duration, and consistency of different types of physical therapy activities, right? And so you can have it do that and make you your own training regimen yourself.
Wow. What challenges remain in ensuring that these advanced technologies are accessible and equitable for
Yeah.
all patients?
Exactly. So, luckily, we have gone past the point of training them to human level standards and PhD level standards or MD level standards, and surpassed it. That we don't have as much issue with equitable access. It's more about education as to how to get it and how to use it. Right. So we're having several sessions. I didn't even think of it until when my mother-in-law brought me an AARP publication about training and use cases. So we're now setting up more training specific to different age groups, right, in this way. So, but it's free. The main thing is the digital divide. Right. So that being access to Wi-Fi. If you have access to Wi-Fi, then there's no problem. It's just a matter of downloading specifically what's useful for you.
Okay.
If it's something that's affirmational, for instance, something like Pi is great, just PI, and that's going to be a kind of friend, a digital assistant that's very happy and supportive, and is like, "That's a great idea. We should talk through that, right?" And so it really got my wife through the pandemic, who suffers with depression. And so she always felt better after, discussing things, going back and forth. I'm feeling this way, etc. And so it's really positive. But they're all there. It just depends upon what specifically the goal is, right? So you have the most sophisticated technology in all of human history, right, at your fingertips. And every day I stare at it, going, "What do I ask?" Right. So it's all there. We just need to know what we want it to do. So yeah. So if you have access to Wi-Fi, no problem. You have a smartphone, no problem. Then you're going to get into other solutions which are going to make your life so much easier, like your glasses you're wearing. I cannot say enough about these as far as accessibility. It is
Wonderful.
amazing. I mean, hands-free, everything. You don't have you can. I mean, of course, you can just look at something and say, how far is that from me? What am I looking at? Just open the fridge and go, "Okay, what can I cook for dinner with what we have in here?" And give me a recipe and walk me through it step by step. So I mean, it's really transformational.
And
Um,
those glasses are pretty reasonable these days too, aren't they?
yeah, so these are they started about 299.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, and there's five other varieties. This one's going to be the Meta Ray-Bans, which are the most popular, but others which of course are good for, say, the hearing impaired. So these are good for augmenting hearing aids, and or if you don't quite need them yet, as are AirPods, right? So AirPods, they got a new feature to where you put them in and it acts just like a hearing aid. But
Hmm.
in addition to that, you have others that are specific to those that may be deaf, right? In this way, they may be hearing impaired completely, and so it'll give you captions, audio captions for what everyone is saying around you that you're just reading. So you don't have to worry about signing and or lip reading. It just like watching TV with captions on, right? It just captions everything, and
Yeah,
so.
you see all these commercials on now, like the people laying on the bed talking to their phone and they're having a full conversation. I mean, or the guy that his daughter plays the guitar and he puts in
Oh,
the ear thing.
oh my God. Oh, that's heartbreaking. Yeah. Oh, I
Isn't that the best commercial in the world? I mean,
cry every time. You're just like, oh, you got me.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I, to wrap it up, we're running a little bit out of time, but what message of hope or inspiration would you like to leave with any patients, caregivers, or the medical community about AI in the future for our recoveries?
Exactly. I'm not a pessimist. I don't believe in dystopia. As long as we we actually use your voices to direct how things are going to go. So, as I would tell people in various talks, like a year ago, there was always concern about bias in output. Is it sexist? Is it racist? Does it not actually give the right information, etc.? And I would tell them, right, you can either be a passenger or a driver, right? So we're not passively, right, once again, just using this technology. Every time you ask it something, every time you give it a query and it gives you an output, they're using that to train it again. So the more you reinforce what you think is important and what is correct. So if it outputs an image, say, give me an image of a doctor, and it outputs a middle-aged white man in a lab coat, you can say, well, there's also women doctors too, right? And so now generate an image of a female doctor, right? And then do it again and again. So now that data set goes back into it and you get greater diversity. So in the same way, now using right the models gives it more information on the topic associated with those who are caring for those that may have had a stroke and or suffered one themselves. But I do like the best thing, the most pressing, aside from robotics and all that futuristic stuff. That's all great in Jetsons and flying cars. But right now, it's the psychological reassurance that you are not alone, right? So I know a lot of caregivers that feel very isolated. Once again, what if you're early in recovery and you're primarily nonverbal, right? And the caregiver doesn't know if they're doing the right thing or when to call someone or if something's wrong, right? So having the access to every medical database and all of human history, right? And talking to it like a normal human is very reassuring. That being, here are the symptoms. Here's what I'm seeing. Should I be concerned? What should I do next? Right. And so just knowing that you're not alone, right? And knowing that the information that you're getting, of course, some models are better for medical information than others, and we can talk about that. But just the idea that at any point you can ask any question, and unlike Google, which of course will just give you a link to a web page that you have to read by way of text, you can interact with it. You could say, okay, this is what I recommend. Like, okay, tell me why you recommend that. Tell me what's happening. Tell me once again how this is going to benefit. Right now, okay, that's too much medical jargon. Right, explain it to me like I'm 5. I love that one, right? Explain it to me like I'm 5, right? Explain it to me in a metaphor of Star Wars, right? So explain it, so you can have it go at any level, right? Explain things over and over, but really it's just the reassurance of knowing you have such advanced information and that you never have to really worry that you're completely on an island. I guess would
Yeah.
be the best one.
Well, we are getting out of time, so I want to thank you. I really would love to do some more of this if that you're open to it, because I think we've only scratched the surface today. I mean,
Absolutely, absolutely.
there's so much available for us right now, and the biosuits and all of that. I saw one where it's hooked up to your head and makes the hand move just thinking about it. You know,
Yes. And so that is actually the next stage in our research is going to be brain computer interfaces. And
yeah,
so you'll just like you'll be able to ask questions to your glasses, have it call people, take pictures, take video, ask questions about what's in front of you. You also early on, if there are issues with verbalizing, right, something, you can just think it. And so this technology exists now. It was developed for those that are paraplegic, etc. But it initially was invasive to where they would actually go into and implant something onto the skull. But now it was actually Japanese researchers designed something that just lays on top of the brow. And so you can just think it. And so this is going to be the next. And again, it's cheap. It goes with hardware that already exists, and is really going to benefit a lot of people, right? Because you just need to be able to think, right? So raise my chair up, right? Turn the TV on,
right,
call
right.
this person, right? That's it.
Incredible. Well, we'll get together and try and get another time to talk again. But I want to thank you for your time today and the fantastic information.
Oh, Happy to. And if anyone has questions, they're free to reach out. I'm so glad to share with the community and hope I can learn more how to support it.
Where did they reach out to you?
Oh, you can email me, jhutson@lindenwood.edu. That's my official account. And then my office number is 636-949-4863.
Thank you so much for your time today. You have a great week.
You too. Stay warm.
You too.